often said there's, not new ways to do really old things, but maybe sometimes the old ways of doing things are the best. But we kind of forget that in the modern world. We always think that technology and innovation offers all sorts of insight into the best way of doing things, but maybe that's not the case. We're going to be looking today at Christian seminaries, and we're going to be asking how they're done now, if they could be done better, and if there's a model or a vision out there we could be following. And it just so happens that there is, and it was put together by a Lutheran, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So we're going to be looking at Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Seminary Vision. We're going to be talking about a book by the same name, Bonhoeffer Seminary Vision, with Dr. Paul House, who is on the line with us here. But first, I want to thank you for listening to the Sin Boldly radio program here at KPFT. If you're listening live, you're listening on the HD3 channel of KPFT, so thank you for already knowing about KPFT. If you're listening via the podcast, do check out kpft.org, and you can learn more about KPFT there. KPFT is Houston-based community radio. We get to do some really innovative programming here at KPFT. Music that, you're not going to hear on the top 40 radio stations, and conversations you're definitely not going to hear, probably not even on Christian radio, anyway, we get to delve into all kinds of interesting things. So do check out kpft.org. And thanks again for listening. I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor over at First Evangelical Lutheran Church in Midtown in Houston. And this show is basically a Christian apologetic show, but we look at what's going on, what's out there, what's trending, and so today we get to kind of take a step back in time and look at one of my heroes, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I am joined in the studio by one of my parishioners, Dr. Wesley Jackson. Of course, I usually call you Wes.
That's perfectly fine.
Okay,
Dr. Wes.
Okay, Dr. Wes. I like that. And I didn't write up a paragraph to introduce you, but you currently work at the the Center for Public History at the University of Houston, so just down the road here. And you have a PhD in German Jewish studies, so you looked at this era of, and this time and place of the world, so you're very familiar with Bonhoeffer.
Absolutely. And
with us on the phone is Paul House. Paul House, Dr. Paul House, is a professor at Beeson Divinity School. He teaches their Old Testament theology and Hebrew. Previously, he taught at Taylor University, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Trinity Episcopal School for Ministry, and Wheaton College. Dr. House is the author of several books, including The Unity of the Twelve, Old Testament Survey, Old Testament Theology, Lamentations, which is a word biblical commentary, and Bonhoeffer's Seminary Vision, which we'll be talking about today. He's been the pastor of churches in Missouri, Indiana, and Kentucky. He and his wife Heather are members of Briarwood Presbyterian Church. Dr. House, are you there?
I am. Thank you for having me, and thank you for letting the world know I couldn't hold a job for several of those years.
Hey, I just copied and pasted off the website, so... Well, no, what's interesting in looking at the books you've read is the Bonhoeffer book kind of comes out of, I don't want to say out of nowhere, but, you're an Old Testament scholar. You're a systematic theologian. So the book on Bonhoeffer is really interesting to me just because, you would think maybe someone who had a specialty in like 20th century church history or something might have a specialty with Bonhoeffer. But you wrote this great book, and that's what we want to talk about. I do want to say quickly, for those who are fans of the Big Bang Theory, I've got two guys with PhDs with me, and I'm like Howard Wolowitz. I'm like the engineer with just the master's degree that everyone picks on. So I'd appreciate if y'all go easy on me. Don't use too many big words or anything like that. But just wanted to get that out there.
We'll do what we can.
All right. Good deal. Okay. So, I want to talk about in the end, what the vision is. But for those who maybe haven't heard of Bonhoeffer, let's start with just a kind of a brief history of Bonhoeffer. Who was he? What were the times in which he lived, and why is he still remembered today?
Yes, Bonhoeffer was born in 1906, and he died at the end of World War II in 1945. He was executed by the German government for being a traitor to the German government. He was born into a very accomplished family. His father, for instance, was the most famous psychiatrist in Germany. Very, very accomplished brothers and sisters. He received his PhD at the tender age of 24 and continued his kind of studies and preparation to be an academic lecturer till 1931. He then taught and was a pastor from 1931 to 35. He was really, at that stage, in those years, as best we can tell, were the years when he said he became a Christian. And so was certainly knew about Christ. He had been educated, but he later said, early in my career, I had not become a Christian. I was too selfish. And so we know by this time he's given his life to pastoral work and to academic theology. Those are also the years that listeners would recognize when Hitler came to power and all that was entailed with that. The church was thrown into turmoil, and Bonhoeffer decided to leave the country and pastor in London, which he did 1933 to 35. He was called back home in 1935 to lead one of the new seminaries, the Confessing Church, the protesting movement within the German church. And he did that for 5 years. That's the subject of my book. Those years aren't as chronicled as well as other years in his life, though that's the year he wrote Cost of Discipleship, which is probably his best-known book. Also, Life Together, which is perhaps his bestseller through the years. 1940 to 43, he was, technically speaking, supposed to be in the German Secret Service, but he was really part of the resistance and continued his theological work. From 43 to 45, he was imprisoned, and as I've said, was executed at the tender age of 39. And so the way Bonhoeffer became known is through his friendship with a man named Eberhard Bethge, who became his literary executor, who was his friend, biographer, and just really wanted to spend a lot of his life making sure his friends' writings were known to a wide audience.
Without Bethge, and I want to say that correctly, and I have a German speaker in the studio with me. Do you think that Bonhoeffer might have ended up in a lot more obscurity? I never considered that, but the way you phrase that kind of indicates that without Eberhard as his friend and biographer, that was possible.
Humanly speaking, I mean, the Lord can do what he needs to do with another instrument, but humanly speaking, I think it would almost have been inevitable. He would have been known. He would have been, I think, appreciated in due course for the books he wrote. But for instance, his ethics book was all his friends doing, editing that, pulling things together. The whole project of publishing his life's works and all the letters and papers that he wrote, that's now fills, I think, 16 volumes. That was all Bethge's influence, a lot of help, of course, a lot of other interests, but it was also the friend who was publishing the letters and papers from prison, which in the 1960s made Bonhoeffer much better known. So, again, humanly speaking, this friendship is so impressive that a friend would want his friend's materials to be seen has always impressed me.
So you mentioned the resistance, and There seem to be sort of two things that your average person, if they know of Dietrich Bonhoeffer at all, they sort of know him as, someone who participated in the assassination attempt of Hitler, or one of the assassination attempts, which involved like hundreds of people, I think. I mean, like thousands of people. So it's not like it was like, him and one other guy and a gun, and I mean, these were complex things. But that said, I mean, he's known as, someone who, as a pastor who was willing to assassinate someone. So you have that kind of ethical dilemma that people love to chew into. And then you have the letters and papers from prison, like you mentioned, which gained him a lot of notoriety in some ways, in all the wrong ways. Like Martin Marty wrote a book recently that kind of talks of, it's like a biography of that book, and he talks about all the different ways that people got a hold of those letters and kind of ran with it in different directions, and maybe some really bad directions. But what I love about your book is that, you do pay attention to a time of Bonhoeffer's life that I believe he would have wanted to be his kind of lasting legacy. And I mean legacy in the best way possible, not a aggrandizement of himself or anything like that. But, I mean, do you think there's some truth that, Bonhoeffer would have wanted what he did from 1935 to 1940 to be really, that's what he would have wanted to be known for, rather than the resistance, which was a kind of historical accident?
Well, Bethge wrote in 1954 that was the greatest contribution that Bonhoeffer made in his lifetime, was that time as a seminary director, where he was shaping the total in 5 years, 181 men, they were all men, to serve as pastors in Christ Church. It's what he gave his time to. It's what he gave his money to. It's what he gave his efforts, his energy. It's what he sacrificed for. And so I think he was very much trying to be a biblical churchman, but to build a community of brothers who would serve Christ together in a Reformed church is really, I think, it's where his heart was. Mainly during his lifetime, he came back from the United States in 1939, largely in part because he said he missed the work with the brothers there. So he really gave his all to this project, and the letters that he wrote after 1940 indicate he missed the work and he loved it, and he had no regrets about giving his life in that way.
Yeah. Well, if you want to know what people value, look at how they spend their time, how they spend their money, and you just told us what he prioritized. So we always want to let people speak for themselves. Well, talk then a little bit about for 2 years he was at Finkenwalde, and then for 3 years they had the brother's house, if I'm remembering that correctly. But talk about 35 to 40, maybe especially 35 to 37, when he kind of had, before the Confessing Church or the Gestapo essentially shut down that seminary. Talk about what he was able to do in those 2 years. What kind of a day in the life would have been like at Finkenwalde? Because it is kind of a summary of then, I think, of what his vision for seminary life would be, at least in part.
Well, it is, and I just correct one thing, that Finkenwalde was the site. It was a small town in eastern Germany. It is where the seminary met from 1935 to 1937. One of the reasons I wrote the book is because he continued the work in other locations with the same daily subject matter that, for reasons that I could go into. The work from 1938 to 1940 is not as well known, but a lot of people don't know he continued the same daily schedule. It was only at two different sites. So at all these places, but particularly best known at Finkenwalde, the schedule went like this. First of all, you received a group of 20 to 23 men who had theology degrees, so they were thoroughly trained in theology through the German system. They had spent a year in internship. They had passed their first ordination exam. They were to spend about 6 months with Bonhoeffer.
Okay.
So that's what the seminary was. The daily schedule was they began the day with silence. So they would wake up. They would go to morning prayer, which consisted of reading a chapter of the Old Testament and of the New, singing of psalms, and of intercessory prayer. There was no sermon. The idea was we start the day by hearing God's word first. God gets the first word of the day. And so also to shape them in Bible reading and prayer. Then they followed that service, which was about 30, 40 minutes, with about a half hour of silence and meditation. Students didn't like that very much at the start, and they kind of rebelled about it, but Bonhoeffer worked it through with them. But after that time, then they had breakfast. Then they had lectures and very serious kind of mental engagement until noon when they had lunch. And then they almost had required recreation. They were supposed to take walks. They were supposed to play games. They were supposed to have a balanced life then, to come back then in the evening for study. And at the end of the day, they had an evening service that closed out the day. So the idea was a balanced life based in devotion to Christ, serious thinking, preparation for ministry, and brotherhood. So again, it was all single men in this case, all men, and that kind of schedule was not what most seminaries did. So it was kind of controversial at the time.
Dr. House, this is Wes Jackson. I was just going to ask, as you're touching on this, talking about how the men who attended, they had been already given so much theological information and training, and I think one of the things that Pastor McClanahan and I found just fascinating about your book is that it's written to address a new era of online seminaries, where we, in some ways, particularly maybe here in, the United States, we have more information, more theological resources at our disposal, maybe in the history of the West. And yet it seems that Bonhoeffer himself recognized the need, even with the men that he worked with, for, that additional component of spiritual formation and practice. And I wondered if you could talk about that. I know that's sort of jumping into a bigger question that you go into in your book, but the similar needs in our time for that spiritual formation and practice in the midst really of a flood and a deluge of great information, where we're not lacking on the information, but I don't know, some steps and things that you've learned from Bonhoeffer that we can start applying, or I don't know that you've started applying. I was interested in hearing about your own experience. Have you started, or did you start integrating more of these like spiritual practices, this sort of schedule that Bonhoeffer was on in your own life and work? I was just curious.
Yeah, I'll start with the second question first, and that is that one of the things that's changed my life the most by doing the Bonhoeffer is doing the Bonhoeffer work was that I'm very, very intentional now about God having the first word in my day. Now, I'm at a stage of life where I don't have a house full of children, all sorts of things. I understand there are differences for different people. But the point is, I get up, and I do want to go straight to the Scriptures, straight to prayer. That has really changed a lot of things. I've always had a long time. I've had a devotional life. But I kind of felt it could come any time during the day as long as I did it, and my predilection was toward the evening.
Okay.
I think there are worse things in the world than having a regular devotional life like I've just described. But what changed for me was
many worse things.
Yeah. Am I giving God the first thing every day? Am I listening to God? Is that setting the tone? Is that the priority? And so that's been extremely helpful to me, and I have observed more silence than I used to. I've tried to learn to listen to God better than I used to. And of course, reading Bonhoeffer will always test your commitment, because he was living in times where it required a great commitment from him and from his friends. Now, on the question about information and formation, I remember a letter that Bonhoeffer wrote to Karl Barth in 1936. And Barth had been hearing about these kind of practices that I just described, and folks felt like these were too Catholic for Protestants, and too legalistic for Lutherans, and so forth. And so Bonhoeffer wrote this great explanatory letter where he said, well, the questions that the men are bringing to me is, how do I learn to pray? How do I learn to know God better? How do I move from being an autonomous student to being a colleague in the ministry? And in very busy times, he had some colleagues that he quoted say that we should catechize and evangelize, just do the work now, and we can reflect and pray and meditate later. He said, I don't think they understand at all today's student, if that's what they're saying. Now, remember, their students, and you would know this context better than I would, I'm sure, Wes, that the political situation, even before Hitler had left Germany, a pretty scary, fragmented, shattered place.
Absolutely.
And so that's part of why a lot of Germans wanted something totalitarian like Hitler. So Bonhoeffer's men, I think, are a lot of today's students. A lot of today's students have come from broken worlds, broken homes. They're living in a time in which a postmodern world, which is not supposed to be any overarching way to bring life together. A lot of them have come from church traditions that are non-liturgical, unlike your church, or that are really pretty frivolous. So they're wanting to know how to pray. They want to know how to relate to God. They're wanting, in a lot of cases, the kind of liturgy that Episcopal Church, Anglican churches, and Lutheran churches have brought. But they're also looking for deep community. And if the early studies that I've seen of the generations in high school and starting college now, if these are correct, that longing will only grow.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that Bonhoeffer's trying to do was help them to see themselves whole in Christ, but as part of a community that loved one another and stood with one another. And I think that's what a lot of people are longing for from a church and from a home and from society. They may not even know that, but that's what they want. So it's one thing to say, well, we've always had libraries. They could just read the information. Or now we have it online, so they just read the information. If education was solely the dispensing of data,
mm-hmm.
we wouldn't need anything. But education, as we know, whether it's done in the home or whether it's done on a good sports team or whether it's done in a college or seminary, it's not just that you have somebody who dispenses the data, but shows you what the data means, why it's important, how it shaped their lives, and how it can shape someone else's life. So information, and I think its original meaning meant not just data, but it went in you and then formed you. So information really ought to be forming you. But we know mentors are absolutely essential to, again, a home, a school, a sports team, anything. So the idea that we've got all this data out there and we don't need people then to help shape the folks, I don't think is true by human nature, and I don't think it'll prove out to be good for the church.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those, there's a new technology, so let's all take advantage of it. But I do want to come back to that. But in Bonhoeffer's day, so he had people that had already gotten essentially a degree, right? I mean, they were already,
Yep.
Okay. Now, they had gotten the information, like we're talking about. They'd already gone to German seminaries, which were very rigorous, right? I mean, they would have gotten a kind of first-class, academic as far as dispensing information goes, they were really good at it, I guess.
Yeah, they would have had Greek and Hebrew and systematic theology and philosophical theology, because American hearers need to understand it's more like a European or UK system is you only study theology the whole 4 years. You're not taking basic science and, general education courses. So the whole thing was they're studying theology, and they had done that. So, yes, they were thoroughly grounded in those studies.
Yeah. Now, just like a minority of German pastors were willing to leave the state church to work with the confessing church, the same would have been true of seminary students, right? I mean, for them to leave, the state church seminary path that they were on and to ally themselves with the confessing church, which they had to know was already drawing heat from the state, what kind of student would have thrived in such a seminary, and then that's going to speak to what kind of student is going to survive and thrive in the church today. But you talk about the kind of student that would have been able to do well at Finkenwalde and beyond. So describe that student for us.
His students are probably more impressive than Bonhoeffer as far as the commitment went, in that they knew they were giving up a sure salary. Within the state church,
right?
They knew that there was not guaranteed placement. They were giving up any prestige that went along with this. Frankly, reminded me of some of the students I had at Trinity Episcopal School for Ministry, where in the late 1990s, early 2000s, these conservative Episcopalians, they had no future in the way the church was going.
Right.
We certainly know that now, but they knew it then. I had colleagues at Trinity who had PhDs from Harvard and such, but they had no career in the Episcopal Church per se. They knew that by being associated with a certain view and a certain way of doing theology, they were not going to get prominence. Bonhoeffer students all knew that. And yet they took it on because of theological fidelity and I think a sense of sheer adventurousness. Some of them, like Betke, had been kicked out of the seminaries of the state church. And so these were people who wanted the ministry because Christ had called them to it. Some of them did go back to the state church. A few of them did. Half of them or more died in World War II. The ones who came out of that tended to be stalwart, long-term Christians. And so our seminary admissions need to take account of, is this person capable, but also is this person called?
Mm-hmm.
Are they tested? Do they have a sense that this is what I must do? And so I think that's the kind of student who's going to come in and be willing to undergo the kind of training in the kind of conditions that they did.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember my first year in seminary, we all kind of sat around in a circle, and after we were done singing Kumbaya, we all told our call stories. That was a joke, a little bit,
right.
but
not
I mean,
much.
Not much. I mean, not much. I mean, we didn't sing Kumbaya; that was already out of favor. But I mean, it really was like, well, I was, I don't know. It was all very individualistic or something, but from the seminary, I never got any sense at all that it was like a passing the buck kind of thing in my tradition. I mean, it was like everyone wanted to push off the responsibility of whether or not the person is called to somebody else. So the seminary, their job was just to instruct you after someone else vouches for you. It's really the synod that sort of confirms that you're called, but they don't know you really well. I didn't know my bishop really well. I didn't know the bishop's staff really well. I mean, I had an interview or two, but your home pastor and home congregation has to vouch for you. But basically beyond that, the synod, or our synod, was like, sure, he's good enough, let's send him to seminary. The seminary's like, well, synod said he was good enough, sounds good to me. And then they sent us off to clinical pastoral education for 10 weeks over a summer. And that was kind of like a weeding out process as well. But in the end, if you got good grades, if you paid your tuition, and if you continued to insist that you had an internal call, even if you were, say, for example, I don't know, teaching something totally unbiblical, nobody really batted an eye. Nobody ever said, well, actually, I don't think that you're called. So that does seem to be missing in the modern seminary. And you talk a lot about that, right? I mean, the fiscal demands on seminaries and universities, I think there's definitely wider application to your book than just seminaries. I mean, much wider. I mean, there's a whole philosophy of education, that really is nestled in your book here. But talk about the pressures of the modern seminary and, how maybe it's handcuffing the church in really discerning someone being called or not, and having some honesty in that process.
Yeah, I think one of the problems for all education right now is that one way or the other, everybody's getting paid per head, per student, right?
Yep.
And so, now I don't think that's a particularly effective secular way of doing things, and so we've got a lot of discussion about how really to value education and that sort of thing. But for a long time, the seminaries, for instance, when I went to seminary, Southern Baptist Seminary 35 years ago, we paid no tuition. However, we had open enrollment nearly. So, yes, technically speaking, your local church had to recommend you. But sometimes there was no interview, there was nothing. Who are we to say this person's not called? This is great. They go on to seminary. Probably nowhere near half of us whoever went there or even graduated from there went into ministry. So because there wasn't enough help. You could call it scrutiny, you could call it help to discern whether or not you ought to be there. But in those days, the seminary, as they still do, got paid per head. So as you can see how this goes when times get tough, and you don't turn someone down.
Right.
It probably shocked most people to know that nationwide, if they're really counting enrollment the way an average human being would, it's over 90% of the people who apply for seminaries get accepted.
Wow.
And of course, now you'd say, well, who's in a seminary? Not in ours, but in a lot of seminaries you'd say, who's there? Well, lay people who don't feel like they're getting enough their church, so they're interested in taking a course. People who might like to just learn more. People who think they might want to go into the ministry, and ministry could be, we got counseling, we've got education, we've got everything under the sun.
Right.
And we think we have to accommodate everybody, so we're going to offer classes any time or night or day, any order they want to take them, so your curriculum's then blown.
Right.
So if a seminary is operating so that it can be paid per head, per credit for degrees that are collection of credit hours, not an organized curriculum, without really being held responsible or accountable to whether they recommend their graduates to the church.
Mm-hmm.
Then what you got is a big overgrown free market situation that's very similar more to a junior college or a certain sort of state university than what the average person would think of the kind of custom work you would do to shape a pastor, find the right ones, and entrust the congregation. So I think that one of the problems we've got is churches need to want to love, honor, ground, and govern seminaries and support them.
Yep.
The seminaries often say, well, if the churches don't support us anymore, we'll figure out a way to mass produce our degrees in a way that will cover the cost. I think this is not only deadly to the church if we're not very careful, but a lot of people go into seminary with good hearts and things and find out 2 years on that they didn't belong there.
Mm-hmm.
And again, on the scale of 1 to 10, you can do a lot worse things and go to seminary for a couple of years. But these were good-hearted people who didn't need to spend those 2 years there. And the resources are tight enough now that we can't afford to spend lots of money on folks who won't go into ministry, if I want to be crass about it.
Right.
So,
well, a correlative to that is the demand on professors, right? Because if professors now have to be jacks of all trades and teach all sorts of people for all different contexts of ministry, and by the way, we call everything ministry, and priesthood of all believers and all that, but, still, what Bonhoeffer had was a kind of singular vision to train one type of student, if you will, for a particular ministry, and there's a real beauty in that. It seems like there's a focus. Now, I'm not saying that that is we can just duplicate that. I mean, it is a more diverse world and all of that. But bottom line, we do need our seminary faculty to be able to have a singularity of focus and talk then about what would have been required at Finkenwalde and beyond for the faculty. Because you say, look, these students at Finkenwalde had awfully, had serious, responsibilities, and they're to be admired. What about the faculty as well? And then correspond that to today.
Yeah, I think so. A faculty like Bonhoeffer, and then Betke helped him, and a man named Willy Rott helped as well. They would receive these students, and so if you're going to teach them pastoral care and preaching and New Testament theology, which is what they taught them, you're going to have to teach at a high level, right? You have to know your stuff. You have to be, on your game and be academically rigorous yourself at the same time, because you're living in the same community with them and spending time with them. You have to be a person who has learned to care about people alongside the studies, and you've had to become a person then who does all this because you love the church. So you're asking the faculty to combine the best that they're capable of doing academically, the best that they're capable of doing pastorally and personally. And so that's the kind of faculty member that you're looking for. So I think that our faculty members today, that the best ones are able to do those things. We have plenty of people who have had professors who only knew their academics and didn't like people. Mm-hmm. We've known plenty of them who were people, but who never read a book after they got their PhD. We actually need to be a both and, the same way we need a pastor to study and think and care for people. I mean, it's really a heart, mind, soul, and strength kind of effort. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think that's any worse for a seminary teacher than it is, say, for a medical school teacher or for business. I mean, the good ones are all involved in these ways.
Right.
So then they're modeling to the students, mentoring them and showing them the skills and showing them the reason why the theology matters and showing them how to do these things. Now, if you take a faculty member who's not paid a full-time wage, unless they then teach 2 overload courses and an online course. I have friends who are teaching massive numbers of credits to be able to feed their families. There are many problems with that, but I was thinking I'm grateful where I work, because what do we tend to do with our free time besides write books? I just spent 2 hours with an alum before you called. I couldn't do that if I had to take on 3 part-time jobs to feed my family. I just, we volunteer our time in our churches. So I teach twice a week for our church. Frankly, because Beeson Divinity School is taking care of me as a faculty member, I'm able to do that. So there are all sorts of knock-on effects where the church benefits when the church invests in their faculty members. But I would say, too, instead of hiring faculty members that have gone off and gotten the best degree they can, and that's it, we need to have a high standard for faculty that would be similar to what we would be looking for in our students, because we want the faculty to shape the students.
Well, that was something that, since you mentioned Beeson, Dr. House, I was going to ask if you could sort of, I know that Beeson has, is it the Bonhoeffer Center for Public Life?
No, we don't have that.
Okay.
Wouldn't hurt us if we did, but we don't have that.
For some reason, because I had seen a video with you and then some of the students that you had engaged with not too long ago. But it was, I wondered if you could talk about just your experience sketching out, based on Bonhoeffer's influence, how you and some of your colleagues how this has affected how you're actually discipling and working with students. Right,
and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is because it helps explain several of the things that we believe in here. Beeson Divinity School was founded in 1988. We've only ever had one dean, and that's Timothy George.
Okay.
And from the very beginning, for instance, we have a life together covenant. So the Bonhoeffer's legacy was important to the Divinity School from the beginning when it started. And periodically, our dean has had us focus, say, on the Barman Declaration or Bonhoeffer. And this year, we focused on Bonhoeffer's ministry at Finkenwald and beyond. We had a Bonhoeffer Day in which we followed.
Yes, that's what I heard about.
Schedule.
Yep.
And it was exciting because we started with the prayer, and then we did the silence. We had first-rate lectures from my colleagues Frank Thielman and Peter Mawish. They're worth listening to on the web. We had lunch. We took a long walk in which people were dialoguing with one another. Some played football. We had 2 injuries. The idea was we would try to replicate that. Now, we're a smaller seminary. We have about 150 students. Mr. Beeson set it up to be small by design.
But that's kind of the point, right?
Well, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the church has this kind of disease almost of like craving the American bigger is better model. The seminaries follow suit. And so you need kind of people to come along and say, wait a minute, there's value in this size, right? And, let's explore that. Let's live this out. So
there's value in quality.
Yeah.
Now, I say in the book, I think an intentional large seminary could have community if you wanted to organize for that and you wanted to do it. A lot of larger places can do that. Most of them don't because of the reasons we already talked about. But here, we don't have on-campus housing, but most of our people live nearby.
Okay.
But we have one chapel a week. That's on Tuesday. We follow that with a community lunch, and nearly everybody participates. We have to subsidize that heavily to have it.
Okay.
We have mentoring groups every Thursday. So today, my wife and I sat down with the 8 students, and we meet 1 hour a week, every week, to pray for one another and to learn to be colleagues, quite frankly, and to have friends in ministry. There's several other things I could say about the place. At Trinity Episcopal, which is in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, some of you know, we had morning prayer, and nearly all the students lived within walking distance.
Okay.
So it was a strong community.
Yeah.
And so I think the American idea of get big or get out, if we're not very careful, we'll all just have to get out. Because you cannot mass produce without personal attention human beings.
Right.
None of us would think what we need to do with our children is to send them somewhere where they'll have no personal contact. We hope that they'll grow to be responsible people. I noticed that when poor people can, they send their kids to colleges like Berea and the College of the Ozarks in Missouri that are free and that pay real close attention to their students. Rich people will send their kids to private institutions where they can get that kind of care.
Right. So
that ought to be a dead giveaway as to what we think's the best way to go.
Yeah. Right. You have a great quote, and I want to spend the rest of our time just reading some of your quotes and because you have some great quotes in here. But one of the things you say is, rather than choosing and forming the best students, they use the typical American wasteful education for employment system of stockpiling as many people as possible. Then they wait and see which ones make it to churches, make it in the churches, and make it to the end of the lifetime of ministry. We seemingly feel we need a surplus to have enough ministers for the churches. Thus, we train them to compete against others. I mean, that is so true. In other words, what we're doing is basically like an assembly line where we kind of front load it with a lot of people, and then they kind of veer off in different directions, and some fall away completely. But at the end, we'll have 25%. And if you look at the statistics, I've heard, for example, I think Greg Kokel did a podcast recently where he talked about pastoral burnout. I can't remember who did, but the numbers are staggering. I mean, the number of pastors, first of all, I'm not even sure the numbers of people that don't make it through seminary, but then the people who don't make it beyond 5 years, much less, a full career in the ministry. So we're wasting who knows how much money educating people who don't give back to the church a lifetime of service. But I want to come back to one thing, and then I'll be quiet. You said something like 90% of applicants get into seminary. I wonder what it is for med school, law school, or even something like welding school or plumbing school. I bet you it's not 90%.
No, and again, I learned when I was supervised admissions here at Beeson and getting to know that whole world that I always have to ask them, how are you counting these people? Mm-hmm. But when it's all said and done, if you don't have a criminal record and you have the money and you have a church that recommends you, the seminaries are going to take you. There's lots of them that believe they're doing the world a favor by having more and more, because their argument is we need more Christian workers, so the more Christian workers we educate and send out, better it'll be.
Yeah.
Well, not if they're not shaped, not if they're not trained.
They could end up doing a lot of damage. I mean,
yes, and again, I just say just to give them the full benefit of the doubt. I don't want to do damage to them. If they need to be plumbers and welders and teachers, for Christ's glory, a Reformation principle is that we need them doing that.
Absolutely.
And so that's where I am on admissions, but the seminaries would need the support of the churches and of donors to make that happen. But no, just on money end, we can't afford to lose 3/4 of the people we spent money training.
Right.
Now, I want to say this too, and I'm too long-winded. I apologize. My seminary basically trained me to be an independent contractor. And they thought that, and I believe they did that because they thought that was the reality of the church, and they were being good to me by teaching me that.
What did that look like, Dr. House? Just out of curiosity, like, can you unpack that a little bit?
Well, yeah. See, so I get my credential, I have my degree,
right?
And in that case, I was in the Baptist ministry, but I see it's an American thing. So that, okay, I need to take a church that I can use to climb the ladder to get a better church. I'm pretty much on my own because even in my own denomination, the other ministers, like it or not, are competing against me for members and money and good positions.
Okay.
So since I am going to be on my own, I need to know that, own that, and learn to play fair.
Okay.
Now, that has been confirmed over and over again by many of my friends who are saying that is correct. That's how we were trained. They did do it with the best of intentions to help us.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem is going to be, is that biblical view of ministry? Is that how we really want to do things?
Mm-hmm.
So no wonder if you don't have colleagues in ministry that you're lonely and dispirited.
Mm.
No wonder if your spouse gets discouraged with ministry, there's not someone else to pick up the slack and say to her, well, we've all been there. This too will pass.
Mm-hmm.
It's no wonder if you ever get out of a church, people aren't all that excited to help you get into one.
Yeah.
So we've trained people a certain way. We've trained them like animals to be a certain way, and that is kind of what they will be. So I think Bonhoeffer wanted to break the mold. They had a whole lot of that. They talked in those days, we wanted a true council of brethren. They named their church body that on purpose. So we'd not be competing with one another. Bonhoeffer writes, I guess as the son of a psychiatrist, there are lots of people who go into ministry to get attention for themselves, to have the church serve them.
Well,
we need to reverse that.
Well, and that was one of the things. That was one of the main things I wanted to ask you is that sort of breaking the mold for Bonhoeffer himself, because as you talk about in the book, that was something that Bonhoeffer had to go through. I mean, he comes from a very privileged background, has the best education in the world, and then I think you mentioned that it's in his letters. He writes that essentially he was in an ecumenical career with a lot of selfish ambition that he could have capitalized on. And yet, something happened, and you mentioned this at the beginning, where I think this is the turning point for him. Like, what is it that changes Bonhoeffer from wanting to be a professional churchman who could have had the largest church that he wanted, with given the skills and the education that he had, and yet chose to sacrifice for a very different track? What was that switch for him that broke that mold for him, that said there's got to be a different way?
Well, it was pretty clear by the time he had come back to the seminary, and as he wrote Cost of Discipleship, that he had come to understand that following the voice of Christ and absolutely giving your life to him was what Christianity was about. Not just for him, but for everybody. It would look different in every life, but this is what it was about. And so people disagree as to what it was that made him come to that conclusion. He never quite says.
Okay.
But you can tell, because he wrote this in a letter to a friend of his named Elizabeth Zen. And he said, I was like a child. I was in it in order to build myself up, my ego, my reputation. And then I became a Christian. And that meant that I had to give myself to Christ, which meant he would tell me to give myself to his church and serve his people, and that everything else came under that. And I would argue that as he tried to work out what his role in the resistance was, he was trying to work out what it meant to follow Christ in such extreme circumstances. That was his compelling question. And so from the time he was converted, the question was, how do I give myself to Christ, give myself to his people, and follow Christ? So once he gave up the selfishness, it's really kind of interesting, because Bethke, one of the things he wanted to do was to make Bonhoeffer known to the world, which is fine, I think. In some of the letters Bonhoeffer was writing to his fiancée toward the end of his life, he seemed to be craving a quiet life. He wasn't looking to be famous. Of course, you might say just looking to get out of jail.
Right.
But he had given up. In fact, he knew that after the war he'd be seen as a traitor.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the things Bethke did. He was trying to rehabilitate Bonhoeffer as a martyr, as opposed to just a traitor to the German people.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
And so, but Bonhoeffer knew the cost, that maybe he was giving up any chance to minister at all by what he was doing, by what he thought was following Christ. Yeah. So I guess in my own life, and I say to the students, eventually we're going to decide, do we want to follow Jesus or not?
Yeah. I just want to throw out a couple of kind of images here. I mean, I think we have to operate. This sounds cliched, but we have to operate as a church and through the seminary process, through the calling of men into ministry and so forth. I guess I'm in a denomination that ordains women as well, so men and women. But we have to trust that the word that falls into good soil will bear fruit, and that it's not going to be the whole bag of seed, So, and also there's the faith of the mustard seed, from this small seed can become great fruit. It seems like Jesus gives us image after image that you don't need a monumental vineyard to produce fruit, but you need people who are really faithful, and God can work through these means to produce great numbers for His kingdom. But if we kind of have that in our mind, I want to read another quote here from you. You say, in short, Bonhoeffer desired to shape servants of the Lord Jesus Christ. He had no desire to produce denominational operators or even what today's American culture defines as, quote, visionary leaders. This desire required teaching every community member to work and to work at whatever needed doing. Let me read one more kind of long paragraph here, because I think it's really, really, really valuable, and it really needs to be heard. In my opinion, this is you, Dr. House, writing. In my opinion, few areas of seminary life today need more revision than what normally passes under the title of leadership development. It's hard to find biblical passages that call for leadership in anything approximating what that term applies in American life. Models for pastors, chief executive officers, or community activists do not exist in the Bible. To find them there, one has to begin with such concepts of leadership and then try to tie Bible verses to them in non-contextual or barely contextual ways. Pastors whose goal is to brand their ministries, build their reputations, manage a complex organization, become popular enough or singular enough to have off-site video churches, command six-figure book contracts for products mainly ghostwritten, and have thousands of followers on social media outlets do not match anything in the pastoral epistles. They match the super apostles who Paul opposed in Corinth. A pastor may need to do some of these things, but if he cannot do them as a Bible-formed praying servant of a community, he is not on the right path.
Ouch.
Yeah, ouch is what I said off to the side of that. But that is so necessary. I see so many pastors who talk about leadership development. I took an entire course in seminary on leadership development, and I thought it was basically a waste of time. I like you said, it's not in the pastoral epistles. We need to have trust that through faith that Christ can work through us in the church, and that Christ will build His kingdom, whether we are following the Harvard Business School of Leadership or not. So,
yeah, I think I'd say two things. One, Jesus spent all His time nearly getting 11 guys ready for ministry, plus upwards of 70. But He spent virtually all His time getting them ready for ministry, and then you see what happened in the book of Acts. When God has a worldwide sin problem, Genesis 1 through 11, He starts over with Abraham and Sarah. Mm-hmm. So what we're seeing here is a God with a domestic heart and a heart for quality and the right people so that the world can be reached. Americans say if we throw enough material at it, we'll surely get it done.
Yeah.
Well, I see why in our history we did, but so that's, I guess that's one thing. And as for leadership, if the first line of the class goes something like this, now that you're prepared to die for your people, let's talk about how that's going to look and how you help people, and let's talk about how the church needs to be run. So once we're ready to die for the people and we realize what it means to be a Christian, well, then some of the Harvard Business stuff, which is helpful.
Sure.
Here's how you might recognize a talented person. Here's how you might run a meeting. Here's how you might lead from the second chair or whatever. But this bit about becoming a big pastor that you read, that is, I hope it's not unkind, but I wrote it in part because I've seen people go down that road, and it's a devastating no-win road.
Yeah.
So I don't like the model in part because I know what it does to the people who try to play that game.
Right. And the people at the feet of the person playing that game.
Yes, absolutely.
Because
I just in the end think it is not about us, and some of the great passages in life together are about people who want to use Christianity to build themselves up.
Yeah.
I think I think it's such a part of a lot of the worst part of American culture, not the best part, that instinctively people think that's what they're supposed to be doing, instead of seeing what the Bible would say ministry and family life and such amounts to.
Yeah. Dr. House, we're going to need to wrap up here, but if you were to take steps, you're at a great place, you're at Beeson already, but taking the principles from Bonhoeffer, is there anything to build a seminary, if you were to do that, what would be some of the summarizing principles that a new seminary would need to have in place?
Well, I asked my wife to help me make a list on that question today, so here it is in a nutshell. Our slogan is serious shepherds for God's people. Serious shepherds for God's people. For that, you'll need spiritual vitality. You'll need theological fidelity. You'll need academic rigor. And you'll need community connection. Okay. And so I could go through all of those, but without spiritual vitality, the theological fidelity is cold. Without the academic rigor, we're just kind of, making it too easy. Without the community connection, I mean, as we study and as we also practice in churches supporting us and loving us, and then receiving us when we go into ministry, those are the building blocks. And finding the right governors, trustees, finding the right faculty and the right students, and not worrying that we don't have 5,000 alumni yet.
Yep.
Trusting the Lord to call and send, and just for us to do our part in His work. We don't have to do it all, just to do our part.
Yeah.
I think we'll be pleased with the results.
Yeah. Well, I think there will be a lot more satisfaction for all involved. It won't be constant burnout. It won't be constant empire building. Let us be satisfied with the daily bread that the Lord has given us on this day. And but yeah, so bottom line here, seminaries, pastors are in the people business. I hate that phrase. I didn't even mean to use it. But I mean, the truth is that everyone in a vocation is dealing with other people. But pastors, of course, they need to love people. They need to be able to relate to people, and they need to be theologically trained. They need to be serious. I think you're exactly right about that. And a degree factory, a degree mill, that's not going to cut it. We do need to rethink. We need to repersonalize, or extend or emphasize the personalization of the seminary experience. And I just want to get your book in front of as many people that are on boards for seminaries, that are teaching in seminaries, that are thinking about going into seminaries, so that they can find a good one. We want to get your book out there. So again, it's Dr. Paul House. The book is Bonhoeffer Seminary Vision. Dr. House, stay on the line for a minute, but we're going to wrap up here. But stay on the line, okay?
Thank you.
All right, and I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Dr. Wes Jackson for being in the studio with me here today. I want to thank all you listeners in Houston, or I guess anywhere in the world, kpft.org. I want to thank you for listening to the Sin Boldly radio program, and I want to put in a shameless plug for the Bonhoeffer House, which is in Houston. If you liked what you heard today and you're maybe considering seminary or active work in the church, go to bonhoefferhouse.org, and you can learn about what we're trying to do, and you can bet that we're going to put some of Dr. House's principles more in play at that community. But anyway, thanks so much again for listening. I'm Evan McClanahan. You can learn more about me and my church at our website, felchouston.org. And let's see, until next time, may you have the peace that passes all understanding. See you next week.